So I'm going to approach this afternoon a little differently than our usual pattern, where we have come back from lunch and we continue talking and having questions, because we want to go over the next two of the four Dharmas of Gonpopa, and I want there to be you have a kind of a fair shot at questions after it's all done, as opposed to having questions now, presenting it, and then saying time's up. So this will require some mathematics on my part and an intention to follow a schedule. So I intend to go through I'll divide it up into 4 parts, actually. Do the third Dharma of Gonpopa. We can take a short stretch, and then do the fourth, another short stretch, and then we have Q&A for a while, and then just sit. You get to be quiet, I get to be quiet. And maybe that's what we came for in the first place. In any case. So going back to the beginning, the way that Gonpopa introduced the 4 Dharmas of Gonpopa, which at that point it wasn't the 4 Dharmas of Gonpopa, he was just talking. He's just saying. He introduced this section, these teachings, by saying, whatever good Dharma practice you do, whether study, reflection, listening, teaching, keeping the precepts, accumulation, purification, or meditation, should not become just another activity. Instead, Dharma practice should be transformative. And so we follow through with where we started with the 4 thoughts, which is one of the most fundamental contemplations that we can do to transform our outlook. Did that, and when we take stock of our situation, which is in a certain way, that's what the four thoughts that turn the mind. They're intended to help us look really clearly at exactly what's going on in our life, what's going on in our experience. To look clearly from a point of view where it can allow us to make some kind of clear-eyed assessment of what we're up to and what might be of use and what the limitations are of just continuing on with habit patterns. And if we have some sense of inspiration there, then the next aspect of transformation involves going for refuge. If we understand the limitations of just following our habit patterns and understand the potential that there is in the Dharma practice, that the potential that the Buddha offered us, then we can turn our minds to refuge. So maybe we'll begin right now with that as the next piece of turning our minds and transformation.
Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. until the summit of enlightenment is reached. I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness.
Having taken refuge, we can think about this in terms of in our life, when we've actually turned our mind towards refuge. Then the practices that we do begin to be transformative in a new way. There are many practices that we could do within the umbrella, you could say, of the second Dharma of Gonpopa. All the practices. But within the framework of refuge, all these practices are aimed towards profound liberation. They're all done in that context. And within the Mahayana outlook, within the outlook of the vehicle of great compassion, all these practices are also done with the motivation to be a benefit and lead to the liberation of all beings. So whether we're doing the practices that cultivate deeper insight into the nature of our experience, approaching things from the side of calm abiding, and then investigating our experience more deeply, when we do these things, these are transformative. Little by little, as we become more familiar with our experience, we begin to understand more about the potential that's there and more about the dynamics of what happens, how experience unfolds, the dynamics of our motivation, the impacts of how we view the world, how we view others. We also have all the practices that relate to relative bodhicitta, transforming our outlook in relationship to others. And Zopa pinpointed one part of that, the practice and cultivation of equanimity. And even if all we do is look to say, just like me, it transforms our relationship with others. In doing so, it also transforms our relationship with the stream of what arises in our own minds. We could also be doing the practices that come from the Vajrayana tradition, the foundational practices, all the other practices. But they will all be transformative in this same way, allowing us to become more deeply familiar with our own experience, how experience arises, and more deeply and intimately connected to how it is that we relate to other beings. gaining a deeper and deeper insight into this great play of interconnectedness. And this kind of transformation just goes on and deepens and becomes more refined and subtle. When we come to the third Dharma of Gonpopa, the teachings that are written down are very brief. They're so brief that I was worried that I wouldn't have anything to say. But the path just continues. It goes on and becomes more refined and more subtle. And what Gonpopa taught in the third Dharma of Gonpopa, the way that the path dispels delusion has two aspects. The first type of delusion is grasping at existence and non-existence, or eternalism and nihilism. This is dispelled by practice in which they are seen as a dream or illusion. The second delusion is acting for one's welfare alone and having a Hinayana or a self-centered approach. This is dispelled by meditating on love, compassion, and bodhicitta. In a way you can say, there's nothing new here. And in a way it's quite true. It's not a radical jump to something else. But what it points to is a deeper clarity about exactly where the problem lies, exactly where the confusion is. And in the previous practices, there are insight practices where we look into the nature of things. In particular, they're often framed in terms of seeing through our illusions about the solidity and independence, whether it's of ourselves, our thoughts, phenomena. In this case, there's a subtle change. When we're undermining our attachment to the solidity of phenomena, whether we're talking philosophically, where we speak about the lack of inherent existence, or we just investigating directly, where we're looking into what we'd say the emptiness of phenomena, there is a tendency to go between thinking things exist in this way and things don't exist in the way that I thought before. And the way that Gonpopa is framing this is we go beyond the question of existence and non-existence. And the antidote that he suggests is looking at the dreamlike nature of phenomena. And it's always attractive to be pulled back into looking at our practice from the point of view of self-centeredness. And so he again encourages continued cultivation of loving kindness and compassion. So I think we can take a little while and investigate how we might approach or how we might think about or begin to jump into the perspective of regarding all phenomena as dreamlike. There's a danger after lunch that dreams will actually be the case. So I'll try to speak very soothingly. Yes, that's now Zopa will take the stick and run around with it.
I'll come with the stick.
The aphorism, which most of you will recognize from the 7 points of mind training, it starts out right at the beginning. Regard all phenomena as a dream. And this should cause us to furrow our brow a little bit. What on earth is this about? We can say, well, my dreams are just dreams and they don't really exist, but here things really exist. But one of the things that we can look at, what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of dreams? What characteristics does our waking experience share with dreams? Do you see things? You think, here I am doing something? Mm-hmm. Thoughts and emotions come, we say things, we do things. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we take for granted in our ordinary waking life is that we are holding the experience of a reality. And in the same way, in a dream, we hold the experience of a reality. The dream is our reality. When we look at a dream, it's easy to recognize when we're looking at kind of after the fact, or if we wake up in it, really deeply wake up in the dream, that the reality is being held together moment to moment. This sense of reality is a moment to moment process, the holding together of a sense of reality. Out here, I tend to think I'll nod off and reality will still be there. I'll wake up and reality you'll still be sitting there. So it's harder to recognize that this reality that we hold is a moment-to-moment occurrence. But we can recognize that. This is not about the usual rabbit hole, or a very common one to go down, is, oh, I'm seeing that out there. I have the experience of seeing that out there. That is my experience of reality, is seeing that. I have the experience of hearing myself talk. sound by sound, word by word. I have the experience of looking at these things or thinking about them. This is an experience that unfolds moment by moment. And the more simply we can look at our experience, the easier it is to actually come into contact with this sense of my experience is actually this moment-to-moment unfolding of experience. Has nothing to do with whether or not the floor is really in front of me or not. I experience it that way. I experience the name floor. I experience all of those things. In the same way, moment by moment, we hold together this sense of a reality. So take a moment and just look. Just be with every aspect of what arises in your experience and simply recognize it as a moment-to-moment unfolding of experience. Let go completely of any kind of internal debate about whether there's something out there. That debate itself is just another unfolding moment-to-moment experience. reflect for a moment whether there's any aspect of what's unfolding as experience that could be separate from awareness. This is not about objects that one thinks one might see, just the experience of seeing, the experience of hearing. Is it even remotely possible that there's anything in your experience that is disconnected from awareness? If we've looked carefully over a long period of time about what arises in our experience, the flavor of the thoughts and feelings that arise, we may have gained some clarity that they are not disconnected from our habit patterns, even though it's very accurate to say we never think the same thing twice. We never have the same experience twice. We put together very similar causes and have what appear to be very similar experiences. The root of all our experience from our ordinary perspective is tinged by fundamental lack of seeing how things are, lack of seeing our experience as experience, lack of seeing the nature of awareness. The specific content of what arises is very connected to all our habit patterns, all the emotional patterns, conflicted thoughts. The deeper we go in our practice, both in terms of familiarization with our own stream of experience and familiarization with our mind, which you could say is the same practice, and the deeper that we go into cultivating profound loving kindness, sense of connection, appreciation with other beings, the more those two sides of the practice become intertwined. We can find very often statements like, oh, the dreamlike bodhisattva has dreamlike compassion for dreamlike sentient beings. The dreamlike bodhisattva does not appear, nor does the content of the dreamlike bodhisattva stream of experience. It's not generated by confusion. It's not generated by afflictive emotions. we can use our capacity for creativity in our dreamlike experience to bring into our dream the image of a bodhisattva, whether in detail or just a sense of presence of a being whose mere appearance in any moment dissolves confusion, settles the mind of those around. The mere sound of the voice settles confusion. A mind at peace which has no neediness, it's sometimes tempting to think of the activity of a bodhisattva as being quite complicated. The bodhisattva is able to figure out in a complicated way some complicated thing to do for complicated beings. But bringing to mind the presence of this dreamlike bodhisattva, in each instant, the depth of the radiance of bodhicitta is immediately apparent. We can allow the presence of this dreamlike bodhisattva to dissolve into us. And imagine that this is our true nature. The presence any moment of the presence resonates, fills space in a way that dissolves confusion. Lifts the clouds of obscurations. The resonance brings joy. Let all effort and intention disappear like a rainbow into space and rest. We'll take a short break in silence, maybe 5 minutes plus whatever it seems to be needed, but short break. Maybe you can get up and carry the dreamlike bodhisattva for a short walk. the shift to the perspective of the fourth Dharma of Gonpopa, may confusion dawn as wisdom. Is a profoundly subtle shift. If over time we have cultivated intimacy with our experience as it unfolds moment to moment, the notion of confusion itself dawning as wisdom might be simple and obvious, I think. As we start out, most of the time in our meditation, when thoughts arise, what arises along with thoughts is a stuckness, kind of like stickum, and the thoughts and our awareness dance along in unawareness. We don't see what's going on, and we're drawn and we're involved. So at the beginning, we have some healthy skepticism about the stream of thought and memory arising in our minds. But not because thought and memory are intrinsically problematic, but because we have such a deep habitual pattern of becoming beguiled, bewitched, falling under their sway. But if we can appreciate over the long term that it's not necessary to have a giant knockdown, drag-out fight with what arises in our minds, that if we understand over the long term that all the things that arise in our minds can be fuel for wisdom and insight, perhaps we can approach the whole process with a little less aggression, a little less anxiety, a little less self-judgment, more relaxation, more clarity, more simplicity. Rinpoche wrote in commentary, he said, "Awareness itself is not affected by any of our thoughts, perceptions, or feelings. They are simply the radiance of awareness, like the waves of the ocean." The radiance of awareness. The waves are not different from the ocean. They are part of it. They simply appear on the surface without disturbing the ocean. In the same way, the various thoughts and emotions appear without disturbing the fundamental consciousness. When we recognize the ordinary mind and see our experience as its radiance, we realize there is no reason to be disturbed by whatever happens. We don't need to run away from what arises in our thoughts. We don't need to run after them. They are simply the displays of indestructible awareness. Whatever experience arises is okay, because in its nature, in its depths, awareness is not disturbed by anything. Anything that appears is simply mind's own radiance. So whether it's the impression of a reality that we hold in a dream, or the impression of a reality that we hold in waking life, there is nothing in any of this experience that is not just the radiant display of the mind. This can encourage this view, just holding this view can encourage a great simplicity in relationship to our practice. When Khenpo Rinpoche spoke about how to do the practice from this perspective, he said as follows: to do this practice of ordinary mind, there's no work to be done. You're not trying to create something or shape your mind into some specific experience. You just want to rest with your mind as it is. The important thing is to not be distracted, to know what is happening at all times. We say non-distraction is the body of meditation, or the main practice of meditation. So whatever is occurring, don't think you need to alter it. Just let the mind rest just as it is. Rest relaxedly within this. And this is how you do this type of meditation.
this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Stretch again as you need, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. May confusion arise as wisdom. So what questions do we have?
So I think it might have been said this morning, but it might have been that I was listening to Kempo saying that, or Eric translating him, saying that samsara wouldn't disappear, that it stays. That we realize nirvana, but samsara is still there. Do you remember that?
There are a lot of expressions that are like that.
So
they're not different.
not different. So when we were doing the dedication, and it was, all beings will attain enlightenment, all in that state. Mm-hmm. I wondered if that's the same way, that they can attain that state, but there'll still be things happening that are yucky. But we won't make that judgment. Or somehow they'll have little glimpses of, oh yeah, or maybe they'll forget to put their sword through somebody, It just occurred to me that maybe it's not as hard. Sometimes it just seems impossible, right?
Yeah.
First of all, we have to attain this state. And then second of all beings. Yeah. But if samsara continues to exist, maybe, I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah.
Is that a question?
Now I'll answer the last question first. But the answer is yes. And now forget the first question. No, no, I didn't forget. This in a certain way, this gets to kind of the forehead furrowing problem with the language. Right? What? How could, we want to go to nirvana because we're in samsara, but then you just told me that nirvana and samsara are inseparable. Why should I start? I'm here already. I'm in samsara. But the difference, it really goes back just to the story that Zopa told this morning. The difference between the Buddha and sentient beings is the recognition. And within the recognition, then there is this, you could say, within the full recognition, the most profound, then there is the profound liberation. You could say the profound freedom in the midst of whatever is arising. And so from that perspective, we kind of have to think, that means that a Buddha could show up and still do Buddha stuff, but we'd still be doing sentient being stuff, right? Otherwise, we'd have to say, well, all the sentient beings have to quit before the Buddha can do anything. And that's not the point of the Buddha showing up. Now that you finally got your act together, and we can see in little ways. Just there's one of the Tibetan stories is if you see kids having a giant to-do over some game that they're playing, and they're absolutely, everybody's in tears and ready to come to blows, and the grandfather is sitting. It's like the grandfather could possibly play the same game, and the grandfather, grandmothers, they could all be having their own volleyball game, and just be delighted at whatever occurred, because they're not fooled about the seriousness of the game. So even within our own life, we can see degrees of freedom opening up. And that, I think, that's an important thing. And even if it's just within calm abiding, just to discover that we're not intractably trapped by that thing that came up. It wasn't, it's possible. So it's like that. We can see in degrees how this is. And it's easy to think that, once we had some kind of really super duper insight, then I wouldn't have any more problems. Nobody would bother me. But until we're actually Buddhas, you could say the difference between the bodhisattvas on the stages of of enlightenment and a Buddha is the Buddha karma actually has been exhausted. But until then, stuff's coming up. So then it's like, well, how do we relate to it? And even if we think, well, I'm always flabbergasted and floored by so many things, but still we work with it. At a certain point, the bodhisattva is not flabbergasted and floored, but that doesn't mean stuff does not come up, that karma does not ripen. So then that's when that sense of all that arises in experience becomes fuel for insight. But then it becomes, as it goes along, it sounds like, I'll tell you when I get there, but it sounds very much like it becomes sort of easier and easier in certain respects. Just like the difference between the kids being lost in the rules of the game and the grandparents not even being lost in the fight that's happening. One of the things Michael talked about many years ago, I remember talking about that beyond the 7th level bodhisattva, and this is like, it's not necessary to remember the numbers in case you really want to test yourself later. I won't be testing. But after the kind of the premise was such, after a certain point, there isn't anything that can happen that does not fuel further insight. And you just think about it like, oh, I can see how that could be. It's not that there's nothing more happens, but whatever it is, it's so clear that it just fuels more insight. And then he said, by the time you get up to be, when you get to be a 9th level bodhisattva, then you sort of know it's not quite all settled, but it's so subtle that it's kind of, you wish for the days when it was obvious. Which I thought was kind of a funny story. So, I don't know.
Well, that was good, thank you.
Yeah.
This morning when I was anticipating coming here for calm abiding or instruction in calm abiding, I was reading the appendix to this Ringo Tulku book he recommended, and I came across a phrase where he's discouraging practitioners from clinging to peacefulness. And that jumped out at me only because I was thinking of calm abiding, and I thought, I don't immediately know the distinction. I'm sure there is one that you could explain between why we would try to cultivate calm abiding, but that we would try not to cling to peacefulness. Do you see? I see my confusion.
There is a little bit of distinction, just technically speaking. The calm abiding being the continuity of attention that's not disturbed by fixations. And so from that point, it's calm as opposed to fixated, but the continuity. And peacefulness, we can have all kinds of peacefulness. We can have peacefulness with an undercurrent of stuff bubbling along, but we're feeling kind of, then there's something going, we can't even quite make out what the conversation is that's going on, but it's beneath this level of dullness. So that kind of thing that's problematic. So that requires kind of sharpening up our attention a little bit, so at least that we don't get sort of lost and carried along by that current. But the spot where Gonpopa, one of the places where Gonpopa talks about this, is actually farther along in the path, where we actually get good enough at meditation that we can sort of think, oh, the point here is to become kind of bulletproof. And from that point of view, we could hold on to kind of a stability, as opposed to cultivating this practice of ordinary mind, where whatever arises is brought into the practice. So it even says, in some instructions say, it's shocking. All this is like, well, we should cultivate the view of emptiness. We should see emptiness. Oh, we should get there. This is like, if emptiness arises, cut it. It's like, what? No, because at that point, then the issue is clinging to the content of what arises in the mind. And we're getting our kind of our control freak thing going again. It's like, oh, I've become a really good spiritual control freak. I can make this emptiness happen all along. There's some great things in that, where he's talking about goes on about the importance of. Where is it? Oh, he's talking about the importance of recognizing the ordinary mind. And he goes on, and I can just sort of imagine Khenpo Rinpoche's energy, where he's really, and he's waving his. I can imagine Gonpopa kind of getting into it. It is better to understand the ordinary man than to not experience perception, or for there to be no percept-like objects, or to have flashes of experience, to be immersed in emptiness like a completely clear sky. This is because these are generalizations formed through inference. However, the ordinary mind reaches the real point and is based on direct perception, which makes qualities greater. He goes on, it's like, it is better than this, it is better than that. It's like, you'll be more knowledgeable than somebody who's steeped in the 5 sciences. It just goes, he's really like, woo, he's gotten excited here about ordinary mind. It's kind of a, It is better to understand Tamil shape of the ordinary mind than to receive the 4 empowerments in sequence, practice generating the deity, and experience the signs of contacting, hearing, and seeing the yidam. It goes on like that. So, but it's like, this is like, there's something about the immediacy and the simplicity of this being there in the midst of this fluidity. So there are different levels on which that could be understood. But that last one is one where he's.
The point is that we can achieve peaceful states and blissful states, and then we cling to them, and then we're out of the flow. We're not open, as Bill's saying, we're not open to the flow anymore. We're trying to fixate. We are fixated on something, and now we're really out of Dharma. We're having a good time, but we're out of Dharma.
They even teach that there are realms where the beings have achieved such mastery that they can just dwell for eons or something in these peaceful states. But from the Mahayana point of view, there is this possibility of being sort of stuck there, hanging out there, and it's really just a state. So it's not something that is the final enlightenment. It's something you could come back from, or it could end. So then what's the point? And so it could be, I think it's good to note that when that kind of peace is talked about, sometimes it is like way down there.
Yeah.
But it could also be true in our own practice. If we have a favorite poem in one of our prayers that we have that we sometimes recite at retreats, and it's about, makes the point that if our peacefulness is kind of an absence of thought, and that's something that would be disturbed by thought, that actually we need to cultivate the ability to work with thoughts, experiences, all kinds of things. And so while initially it's good to even just get any kind of calm abiding going. Mm-hmm. So we try to work with simple circumstances so that we can build up that ability, but gradually we need to include more of our experience and being able to work with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, crucial point of practice. It has this great line. So we can cultivate this one-pointed, thought-free samadhi, but when we get up from meditation, the rotten corpse of our thoughts will rise again. See, Patrul Rinpoche has a way with words. Shocking. Yeah. The 37 practices of Bodhisattva also towards the very end talks about passing right by the 4 deep absorptions, that's what the absorptions that can lead to this kind of almost beyond time blissful state.
And that's what the Buddha did when he worked with all those teachers who had deep samadhi, deep shamata practices. But what he did that was new was pass beyond the 4th jhana. That's what it says in the sutras. And this ordinary mind is that everything is, well, Bill has said it better than I can make it up, but everything is the luminous appearance. All appearances are from that foundational mind. Nothing wrong, nothing to fix, nothing by its nature pure. Not how we experience it, but we are headed that way on this path. So the Buddha left every one of those teachers because he said to each one of them, I've accomplished all you told me, do you have more? And they'd say things like, no, but would you stay and lead my Sangha? And he'd say, no, there's something else. I'm not out of suffering yet. Yeah.
Well, I have a question I'm sort of embarrassed to ask because I figure I should know the answer. It's taught that we should look directly at experience. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the last few months I've had tremendous pain in my neck and back, which I have tremendous aversion to. And sometimes I will just stay with it and look at it as long as I can. But I guess I'm not sure what looking at your experience, give me some down-to-earth examples.
Well, I think I'm going to go back and recite what Khenpo Rinpoche said. To do this practice of ordinary mind, there's no work to be done. You're not trying to create something or shape something into some specific experience. You just want to rest with your mind as it is. In this case, mind and experience as it is. If we're going to go deeper into this, then one of the things that we have to, in a certain sense, we have to kind of increase our panoramic perspective so that the panorama opens up and turns and includes that sense of one looking at the experience. And if we've not done that before, that's like a separate piece of practice there. But I think at the beginning, it's important not to feel obligated to go beyond what your capacity is. Because that, I think that sets up kind of a bad feedback loop of feeling bad about what's one's experiences, and then feeling bad about not being able to not feel bad about it, and just kind of loop. So in cases like that, I think it's best done kind of sort of lightly and with as much sort of sense of this is a part of my panoramic experience. And as Rinpoche said, he said, very good to do practice a lot and briefly, and particularly with things that are challenging like this. It's not good to try to drag it out, because there'll be some part of us that will get more and more tight, because we actually haven't seen how it is to relax in the midst of it. So I think it's not magic. It's not magic. We can see a little bit more by looking a little bit more, and we look a little bit more and see a little bit more. But it's simple. It's simple. Simplicity is kind of the key to it. And part of that is actually take some coaching in order, just like I said, we increase the panorama to include looking at that experience of having one that watches the experience. So that's kind of a coaching on how to look more at experience. And we can go into it in more detail too. A lot of that would be not so much directly like all about that pain. It would be let's look at our experience in other ways, and then we'll kind of increase this panoramic sense of I'm using the word panoramic kind of loosely, but this a wider sense of an appreciation for the dynamics of experience and the dynamics of awareness. What's left? Or did it even get started?
The pain is very distracting, usually.
Mm-hmm.
Today it hasn't been. Meditating with a Sangha is a whole different experience. When I'm home alone, that's mostly what I'm distracted by when I sit. I'll have to think about what you said. I'm going to re-listen to this streaming.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get mixed up because the first 10 years of my practice was in the Vipassana Theravadan tradition. And so sometimes I get mixed up with those instructions compared to these instructions and get myself confused.
Since I don't know the instructions, I can't do a compare and contrast.
Yeah.
But my general advice would be to keep it simple, and to be very kindly about it, sort of short and sweet, and to the extent that you're actually using the pain as an object of investigation, also be very brief about that, not to get wrapped up in that. And part of the kindness is using the power of the mind to attend to things, to attend to very different things that we might call entertaining. So to actually say, oh, actually when I sing, or when I go for a walk and I see a beautiful sunset, my mind can go and rest on something else. I can actually see. This is like, oh, I can return to the object. In this sense, it's like, what's that? Well, it's my ordinary experience of the beauty of the sunset or the beauty of a sound. So that, I think, that's worth folding in, because otherwise it can become kind of puritanical. And that's like, that will go back into that kind of a non-productive loop, I think.
I do have a tendency to be a fundamentalist.
Yeah.
Fundamentalist Buddhist. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked with a lot of the same thing with arthritis and asthma. So one of the things that I found helpful, what Bill said, very helpful, approach kindly, short meditations. Laying down meditation, totally acceptable. So you can give your back and neck a rest. And that the piece of 2 pieces, just common acceptance of the situation is a movement toward this this open approach of Mahamudra. It's more open, just this is what's arising right now. And then when I pile on aversion, then I look at the aversion, let go of the pain, because we've been looking at the pain. Then I go, wow, I've got a ton of aversion to this. What's that? And I look at the aversion, because it just piles on like layer. And then I'm judging myself for having aversion. And then, as Bill said, then I'm discouraged. And well, if you get to that, best to go out and see a sunset. Just step away, because the mind is not, I find my mind at times not flexible enough to engage it. So I engage in something else. You can always go to Tonglen, even 1 minute. May I become able to take this on for all beings. Or 1 minute of so many beings are suffering from this. Just joining them in that moment. It just opens it off of me. Yeah. Those are things I try to use over and over, and they seem to work. If I can remember them.
Thank you.
Did you want? Yeah. There are many people here who have more experience with this than I do.
A really short comment. 30 years ago, I learned, and many cancer patients and chronic pain patients are taught to look at their pain in exactly the same way that we look at our thoughts in Mahamudra. Where does it come from? Where is it? Where does it go? What color is it? What shape is it? All those things. And it can be very, very helpful with pain.
Yeah.
I have a question about the 4 immeasurables. The first 2 seem pretty straightforward as I understand them. And the first one's about love, loving kindness, and when you wish happiness for all sentient beings and the root of happiness, it kind of embodies love. Same for compassion. When you wish the end of suffering for all sentient beings and the root, it's like that embodies compassion. And the third one has always confused me a bit, because I understand that the feeling that is attached to the statement, there's various forms, but the one I usually use is, may all people experience the supreme, sentient beings experience the supreme happiness, which is devoid of suffering, which, so a couple things about that have kind of confused me. One, it sounds like that's enlightenment, so why not just say, I wish enlightenment for anybody, everybody. And the other thing is that the feeling connected with it, as I understand it, is rejoicing in the happiness of others. And then Lama Michael talked about rejoicing, particularly about people who do things that make them happy because they're on, they're sort of Dharma related, with it, and rejoicing in their joy that comes from that. So, and this gets a little complicated, but it actually becomes a practical problem when I'm sitting there, because I'm thinking, well, I want to cultivate sympathetic joy, but when I say I wish supreme happiness, which is devoid of suffering, it doesn't seem connected to that feeling in the same way that the first two do. And the fourth one, to me, is a little bit of a hybrid of both, but we don't need to get into that. But any comments about that, I'd be interested in.
In my wanderings about in the Dharma, I found a fair amount of commonality about loving kindness, a fair amount of commonality about compassion, a fair amount of commonality about equanimity, but when it comes to the immeasurable joy, it's kind of, you know, there is a lot of divergent commentaries on that. And consequently, I've also, for a long time, found that of the immeasurables to be the most puzzling. Kind of like I understand it's kind of like going along on the xylophone and things goes ding, ding, clunk, clunk. I just can't, should I say it here or there, and it wasn't until I put it in the context that you were alluding to, Michael's context, like rejoicing in the things working out well because good causes have been put in place. Then at that moment, then the four kind of reformulated themselves in a certain way, where loving kindness and equanimity sort of fell in together. As this is sort of the core is this profound positive outlook towards sentient beings without bias. And then within that, what arises in particular circumstances, one may find sentient beings in the process of causing themselves suffering and others suffering, and compassion arises. And compassion from that point of view is not just an internal feeling tone, it's connected to actually being of benefit in that situation, extending what might be useful in that situation so that the suffering and the causes of suffering were ameliorated. And then paired with that, the rejoicing is kind of like the mirror of that, seeing the causes of benefit and the happiness and well-being that results from that, then extending you could say the mirror of the compassion. Instead of wishing to dissolve the causes of suffering, one wishes to enhance the causes of happiness. And so the joy is kind of this, there is this kind of resonant goodwill and good feeling in that. And that then could be expressed in said sort of, you got a good start, now run this one all the way to this sacred bliss, which is free from all suffering. So that's the way it worked out. But this is kind of my own, now I'm one more finger pointing in another way. So it's like, well, according to me, it looks like, so take that for what it's worth. But I too found sympathetic joy to be until I put it in that context where loving kindness and the equanimity were sort of like the container that held all circumstances, and then within that, meeting whatever circumstance in the particulars of the circumstance, which will have both causes of suffering and causes of well-being mixed in to rejoice and kind of cause like the sympathetic strings on a sitar, where you pluck one string and then the other one resonates. And it's like the sympathetic joy is like yes, kind of humming together, getting the whole situation humming more in the direction of causes of well-being. And then the note that's played for in circumstances where the causes of suffering are there is the note that untangles the causes of suffering and soothes the suffering itself. So that now I've said everything twice.
And of course, I'll add something. And then I need to go. My family from out of town is here, and it's a rare opportunity, so I'll be leaving early, not because of anything Bill said. We'll talk later. But I think it's helpful, two things that help me with this joy piece, or supreme, what was your language? Supreme happiness.
Happiness, which is devoid of suffering.
Yeah. The first thing is to remember all the four immeasurables have this relative sense to them, everyday sense. Everyday loving kindness, everyday compassion, everyday joy. So on that level, the joy is an antidote to jealousy. We see someone, sometimes in our kleshes, someone gets something, someone has some happiness, and we're like, why didn't I get that? Or I don't have that. So the contradiction is rejoice in that, because here's a human being. You want them to be happy, right? And they're happy. And here's the mind turning towards jealousy, competition, even in a mild way, that stops us from rejoicing in others' good outcomes. But the other thing then is to remember these are paramitas, so the supreme added in might be confusing, because it's not just supreme joy, it's supreme equanimity, supreme, loving kindness, supreme compassion. They all have a far-reaching effect, and right into the total emptiness of each. So it may be the confusion with language may be where the others seem like a relative level, I can get it, and suddenly joy has this supreme, but they all have that aspect.
Well, if I could just chime in here, sometimes I have, though, if the thing about rejoicing in other people's happiness, especially as an antidote for envy or something like that, that's great, but it doesn't seem to me that phrase captures that very well. Personally, so sometimes I've added, informally, may I rejoice in the happiness of others.
Yeah,
and at a, yeah.
And if you read 10 lamas on the four immeasurables, you'll find all those languages. The language you have is a language unfamiliar to me. My point is that you'll find different language for the four immeasurables. There's not just one way to describe the joy. Okay, so you might want to just
do some homework on that.
Yeah. Look at some other folks, and then that gives us the broad. And then Bill added some from what he knows, and I just added some, and it gives us this nice broad palette to work with, So we don't have to get stuck on the very first language we ever heard. I get stuck that way, but I heard it like this, and actually, you got the point. Buddhism so broad, so diverse, so beautiful. It's like a mosaic, and we can allow that, or we can allow the strings to resonate and not just say, I only want to hear that one string. Okay? Great.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
I would
Thank you,
just
Zopa.
agree with the point of not being restricted by some language that we have in a, somebody wrote that text or poem, or, I mean, it's in our Ngondro text like that, and I've found that confusing too. But just know that, I mean, when you hear teachings like Khenpo Rinpoche and others give, then you know that it's referring to all that. And I think it's perfectly fine to add or, make your own language, or find a prayer that, gives you some language, either one of those. I was noticing, I was remembering when, at one time also when Bokar Rinpoche was giving just a little short teaching on the Four Immeasurables, because they were in a text that, practice text that he was going over, and on the equanimity he mentioned, well, this is really, we're wishing for our equanimity. It wasn't, the language is more like, I hope you all, and we all, I hope everybody gets equanimity, like they, I hope they all get happiness, hope they don't get suffering, I hope they all get equanimity. But he was saying, really, this is about us having equanimity. And when we study these and practice them, that's what we emphasize, is our own equanimity towards all beings, and that's what gives us the basis for wishing the happiness for everyone, wishing the lack of suffering for everyone. And so I thought, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Rather than, I hope you all feel equanimous.
I hope you all get over your stuff.
Yeah, so I think there's, so now when I say that, I remember that too. And so it's just over time, we get more and more meaning that can be associated with these short little phrases.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I also had that same thought. Well, I'm wishing everybody else, but I thought I'm supposed to be cultivating it for me. Is that really doing it?
Yeah.
So, thanks.
The active practice for cultivating equanimity it's all about, the process is all about our attitudes. And so the first thing part of the practice basically involves taking somebody we like and somebody that we don't like, and then imagining that the person that we like does all these things that the person that we don't like is doing, and the person that we don't like is doing all these good things, and then we really imagine that, and then we start to see, oh, the needle just swung from here over to there. And when we can watch that the feeling tone in our minds swing, then we see who's pointing the needle. That it's actually we've generated all that. That's not intrinsic to others, that we're the ones holding this judgment. And then we can start to see, actually, it's possible for us to cultivate, because we just played this dirty trick on our friend and did this person who deserves nothing this great favor. Actually, we could step out of that game. It's actually within our power to step out of it.
Thank you.
I have a procedural question.
Yes.
Since on a normal all-day sit, I would have rung the bell 20-odd minutes ago. So I was wondering which way we're going to go from here.
Well, I was just about to see, holding up the gavel and saying, any more questions? Barring none, okay. Short break, then short meditation, and then then the Mahamudra aspiration prayer. So, what's left on?
Super simple questions about practice, and it's two. One is language related. Until the summit of enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense. So because it's repeated so many times, I'm like, okay, let it be there. And the other one, so it's like to reflect upon it, because
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm stuck
Mm-hmm.
with language.
Mm-hmm.
But since it's like the refuge,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like that's where I want to set my practice, and so I don't understand that. And the other one is, why do we practice with open eyes?
You didn't say why summit made, well, I didn't even know whether it was summit that made no sense, but I'm picking out the word summit as the one that doesn't make any sense.
You are right. It's like enlightenment is like in the summit of a mountain or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know it's not pointing there, but somehow I cannot. And like enlightenment is like one single point instead of enlightenment being all.
Well, I will pretend that I know something. The summit, if you're climbing a mountain and you get to the summit, you can't go any farther without going back down the other side. So it's as far as you can go. That's the only meaning that I've ever implied to it. It's just not the location or something else, but just that when going up the mountain, you can't go. The summit is the summit there, and in terms of the spiritual path, enlightenment is like that. You don't. It takes care of whatever the need to go up a hill has been taken care of, because that's done. Why do we practice with our eyes open? In some practices, people close their eyes, particularly some traditions. But if we think about, this is actually very appropriate, connected to the ordinary mind practice. We think about our experience, and if we close our eyes, it can be easier to settle the mind in certain ways, because we've withdrawn from a large domain of sensory input that we react to. But from the point of view of ordinary mind, it's just more experience. So over the long term, even if one found at times it was helpful to close one's eyes for practice for whatever reason, in the long term, being able to practice with every single aspect of what arises in experience is important. And not to, well, I'm fine with all phenomena except for when I open my eyes. As soon as I see you, oh my God, I was good until then. So it's just that the panorama of experience, being able to carry that in there. But at times it's useful to. Sometimes it's just a matter of our eyes just feel bad, so don't fight with it. Sometimes it's easier to attend to some aspect of the practice. That's okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
P.S.
P.S.
Just one thing on the summit thing is just, again, knowing that all our refuge prayers, in a way, they're saying the same thing. So if you think of other prayers, what did they say? And of course, the Sanjay Chudong is often translated until full enlightenment. So you know what full enlightenment means? That means it's not just me, but it's not full unless all of everybody is with me. So I think the summit is just a poetic way, again, of like you saying, like there just isn't anymore, but it's just a poetry word. The word full is, maybe more, but we say that all the time, so, you get these different words, and maybe that helps people, think again, and so. But it's not a unique, it's not the summit of refuge prayers. There's a lot of them. It's just one peak.
Okay. Or less. Yeah. Well, just whatever feels comfortable, because we're not kind of getting ourselves all loosened up for a whole hour of sitting. We're just a little bit, and then time for the Mahamudra aspiration prayer. So, sure.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.